so when they started doing a lot of research in the 50s and 60s on which diet may be best, they found a lot of people in the Mediterranean lived a long life, so they tried to extrapolate it to their diet. We now forget that these diets historically used to contain a lot of pork and fish, whereas the Mediterranean diet is now popularized as avocados, pastas, breads, and olive oil and olives, which it simply wasn't.
Hey guys, today our guest is Dr. Pran Yoganathan. Dr. Pran is a gastroenterologist, gastrointestinal endoscopist, and hepatologist in Sydney, Australia. He's a strong advocate for preventive healthcare using nutrition and lifestyle. In fact, he suggests that we should reverse the dietary pyramid to end the epidemic of obesity and to become strong and healthy. I'm very happy to invite Dr. Pran to the show. Thanks, Pran, for coming to the show.
Thank you, Srinivas. I appreciate you having me on. It's amazing that we can connect from two different countries like this, thanks to modern technology, and I look forward to chatting to you today.
Thank you so much, Pran. Pran, before we go into the questions, can you say where can people connect with you?
Look, I've got an online presence. I tend to be quite active, particularly on Instagram and Facebook, because I tend to generally use visual mediums to communicate my message. I'm also on Twitter, but my Instagram handle is Dr._Pran Yoganathan, and my Facebook profile is identical to that as well. I tend to do some blogs on my website as well, but Instagram and Facebook is where I'm generally quite active.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, my first question is, can you briefly explain what is expensive tissue hypothesis and how it made our guts simplistic?
Yeah, no problems. Look, it's quite evident that we've shifted our journey from an ape-like ancestor to where we are now as modern humans. Has been a very dynamic, explosive course, actually. And the expensive tissue hypothesis, which was formulated some decades ago, it's really quite an elegant hypothesis which stipulates that for our brains to expand and become what they are now, we had to save on energy elsewhere in the body. And with primates such as gorillas, orangutans, with whom we share a common ancestor, their gut takes up a fair bit of energy in terms of the modality or the method in which they eat. They require a lot of energy to be able to ferment and break down these energy poor calorie, poor nutrient, poor foods, and particularly through the process of fermentation. This requires a lot of blood. Now, as we as humans started adding nutrient-dense foods into our diet, in particular foods like bone marrow, meat, organ meat, the gut became less of a fermentative organ and more of a proteolytic, lipolytic organ. So quality absorption is done in the small intestine. And this is less energy required to do that. Now, when that occurs, the brain, it frees up energy for the brain, and which allowed for quite a rapid expansion up. And it coincides with when we began to hunt. And also, there's also another rapid expansion when we discovered fire, because it unlocked a lot of these nutrient density in these meats to us, to our body to be able to be absorbed. So quite an elegant hypothesis, and the simple way of looking at it is for our brains to become what they are now, the gut had to get simpler.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, majority of my subscribers comment about that they are having problems with gastric. For example, they experience gastric problems. Why do you think that many people nowadays are facing such problems?
Yeah, look, I mean, to me, it makes sense that the gut basically struggles with the modern day diet. You know, as we move away from a diet that is ancestrally appropriate to a diet that we are surrounded with now, it makes sense that the gut struggles with that. Once you introduce genetically modified foods that no longer really are similar to or are dissimilar to the foods that we've historically eaten, even during the period of agriculture in the last 10,000 years, that's going to make things even more of a struggle. Even foods such as wheat in the last 50 to 60 years has been genetically modified significantly to a point where even digestion of wheat-based foods and cereals has become more difficult. So we live in a chemically modified, genetically modified food environment, and I think our gut struggles with that. And that's a very simple sort of overview, but I think that's the best way to summarize that.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, you said that Brassica vegetables are bred from weed. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's a well-known fact that there is a non-nutritious weed known as the Brassica plant, which over a period of perhaps a few thousand years to maybe even a few hundred years, we've bred into the Brussels sprouts, the kale, the spinaches, the kohlrabis, the cauliflowers, the broccolis. This is all from one plant. Now, our ancestors, when we evolved pre-agriculture, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, would have had to eat that weed, which is a very non-nutritious weed, which probably made them sick if eaten in high enough quantities. Now, when we discovered the ability to be able to plant, grow, selectively breed, well, we just started selecting for these traits that we find appeasing, So the Brassica plant did not exist, or the modern day Brassica products did not exist where we spent majority of our time as hunter-gatherers. So one has to question if they're essential for life, if human life existed well before these plants came into effect.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, whenever I talk about anti-nutrients or toxins like oxalates, many people think that our liver can detoxify them forever. What do you say about that?
Our gut and our liver and our kidneys, they're amazing organs, but I think we have to take into consideration that a lot of plants do come with their baggages, and oxalates are one such baggages, but there's many of these in nature. So there's plenty of phytotoxins in nature, tannins, phytates, oxalates, even fibre in itself, there's very little nutritional value in fibre. My philosophy has always been every meal has to count for something, and if we're constantly putting our body through an anti-nutrient when we're eating, I think it struggles. In particular, when we're built, as we said, for nutrient density, food that is easy for our system to break down, which allows for quite a phenomenal brain to work at its maximal capacity. Yeah, we have to be wary of plants. I'm not saying that all plant food is bad. I think the agenda that's being pushed is that plant food is somehow the panacea for health, and we have to be wary of that. I think to exclude meat-based foods or animal protein, would come at a detriment to the population, as is evident in countries such as India and China and continents like Africa, where a higher dependence on a plant protein generally predisposes to iller health, in particular in relation to metabolic syndromes such as diabetes.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, what do you say to the people who say that hunter-gatherers' lifespan is short? So why we should mimic their lifestyle?
Yeah, it's an argument that I hear a lot. I think it's a very flawed argument. These people exist in a very harsh environment. They exist in an environment which is definitely difficult, and that's why we began farming, because the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is not easy. So take, for example, the arduous journey for a child through the birth canal of their mother. That journey in itself, we take it for granted in the modern world, but it is a difficult journey that the baby makes and then the mother goes through. So a lot of hunter-gatherer children, without the modern-day obstetric care that we provide, they can die during childbirth. That includes the mother and the child. In addition, they are prone to developing enteric infections, which is infections of the gut, through drinking contaminated water and eating contaminated foods. Again, a reflection of how difficult their life is. So 40% of these people will be dead before the age of 15. So of course that skews average age. Whereas once you hit that age of 15 and these immune systems become fully developed, these people are able to weather infection a lot better. And these people will often live on till 70 and 80, and again, die of infection at the extremes of age. So This is how humans die of infection. We've forgotten how to die from infection. Now we die from chronic illness, such as heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease. So we've really lost sight of how we used to live. So to answer your question, yes, the average age of a hunter-gatherer is 35 to 40, but 40% of them are dead before 15. This really skews average age. Those that survive beyond 15 will go on generally to live a happy, healthy life, only to succumb to infection.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, can you talk about satiety ratings and protein leverage hypothesis?
Yeah, that's my favorite hypothesis, Srinivasa. You know, protein leverage hypothesis stipulates that when you maximize protein in your diet, you generally will achieve satiety. Satiety equals satisfaction. So, you know, what we generally think obesity and diabetes is, or what is popular in the media, is that somehow these are diseases of willpower. What I fundamentally battle with a lot of my colleagues and a lot of my patients, I tell them it's not. It's simply a body that has been nutrient starved, whether the nutrient is minerals, vitamins, or amino acids. The body has a set target, in particular in relation to amino acids. It must satisfy that. Now, if that's not met, the instincts within the brain, within the midbrain, kick in, and we constantly crave and we search out food. The problem is, in the modern day world, we're surrounded by an energy-rich, processed food environment. So we've created that environment for ourselves. So in the setting of protein deprivation, the species known as the human will crave energy, and they're surrounded by a chemically modified, corporate-driven, energy-rich environment, and that spells disaster. So it really takes willpower out of the equation. Whereas if one is fully leveraged on protein, if they've essentially activated the lever to search out satisfaction and satiety in animal-based protein, which tends to be of higher quality than plant-based protein, they will not crave energy. And so it really, again, just destroys that willpower hypothesis.
Yeah, thank you, Pran. Pran, do high-protein diets damage our kidneys?
The simple answer to that is no. that myth has been disproven many times.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, what are your thoughts on Mediterranean diet?
Yeah, it's a varied diet. I mean, the people from the Mediterranean historically have always consumed a lot of fish and pork, and in addition, a lot of people that come from these regions, you see them even in an outpatient setting. They tend to live a very long life. It doesn't matter what their health is like. They somehow built into their genetics is a long lifespan. So when they started doing a lot of research in the 50s and 60s on which diet may be best, they found a lot of people in the Mediterranean lived a long life, so they tried to extrapolate it to their diet. We now forget that these diets historically used to contain a lot of pork and fish, whereas the Mediterranean diet is now popularized as avocados, pastas, breads, and olive oil and olives, which it simply wasn't. In addition, a Cochrane review done in 2019 showed that there is no benefit for primary prevention of heart disease or even secondary prevention. So, for example, if someone goes on to have a heart attack, putting them on a Mediterranean diet doesn't change outcomes. And it makes sense to me because the modern day Mediterranean diet is very much carbohydrate-based, and it's more a product of media-based marketing or corporate marketing to push their products out, to push the products rather than it being anything factual. So I see a lot of problems with labeling the healthy diet as a Mediterranean diet because that simply doesn't exist.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, what is your opinion on fiber?
Well, fiber is an interesting one. I am not anti-fiber, but I understand the role that it plays within the gut. Fiber is used by the body to in the colon, which is the hindgut or the large bowel, by the bacteria, the microbes that live there. They ferment fiber to liberate something called short-chain fatty acids, which are a type of ketone, and the most prevalent one being something called butyrate. Butyrate is a fuel for the enterocytes, which are the cells lining the small bowel, and the colonocytes, which are the cells lining the colon. So fiber can be utilized in that way, but the other byproduct of that is methane, hydrogen, and nitrogen, which basically are gases, very volatile gases that can stretch the bowel and they can impair gut motility. So if you were to see someone with abdominal bloating, generally concurrently they'll have a lot of reflux and regurgitation. It's because their motility is being compromised. And we as humans, we are less efficient at fermentation than compared to our lesser primate cousins, such as the chimps and gorillas and orangutans. We are capable of fermenting fiber, but it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all. It does provide satiety, probably because of the butyrate molecule. Ketones tend to promote satiety. It's a signaling molecule to switch off appetite in the brain. So a high-fiber diet can be protective when you compare it to the standard Australian or the standard Western diet. However, we've got to remember that the body is utilizing fiber to create fat. There is a message in that.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, what do you say to the people who suggest that we should maintain an alkaline body or alkalinity?
I'd say bullshit. Yeah, look, I think that is it's a rubbish theory, and it holds no scientific, backing. So I would dismiss those theories very quickly.
Yeah, but can we influence our alkalinity, Pran? Is it possible?
No, we look. The body will regulate. The body works within a very strict system, and it will buffer accordingly in terms of an acid-base balance. But we are acidic digesters. That's what we are as humans. We've got a very acidic stomach, and it's there for a reason, because it cleaves protein efficiently. It decontaminates food, because we are, as a species, built to eat high-risk foods, which is meat, which oftentimes in our past would have been contaminated by bacteria, often old meats. And, you can imagine before the advent of refrigeration, which is only a few decades old, 60 to 80 years old, before it became commonplace, you can imagine like the ability to be able to decontaminate meat with a highly acidic stomach was very, very beneficial. So there's all sorts of evolutionary advantages built in with a highly acidic stomach. However, in the modern world in which we exist, we don't utilize the stomach the way it was meant to be utilized. So, of course, it tends to struggle.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, what is your opinion on fruit?
Look, fruit in itself is not necessarily dangerous. I just think in someone with metabolic syndrome, consumption of metabolic syndrome being diabetes, obesity, fatty liver, consumption of fruits probably doesn't benefit them that much. I mean, it certainly is a hell of a lot better than drinking a can of soda, which contains high fructose corn syrup. But to put it in an equivalent manner, eating 100 cherries, all right, okay, or eating 5 bananas or 5 apples would probably equate to 1 can of soda. Now, the thing with the bananas and the cherries, they often bring with them some nutrients. There's an element of satiety. There's fiber in it that the body can use to ferment. So, that satiety aspect of fruit is good. However, we have to remember that fructose tends to be a very lipogenic molecule in our body. So the body converts fructose largely to triglycerides. And someone with metabolic syndrome, their liver is often packed out with triglyceride or fat. So you're just adding to the damage. You're better off consuming foods that are less likely to create de novo lipogenesis, which is the formation of fat. You're better off using energy to digest food. And this is why protein is so powerful, because it is very energetically expensive for the body to break down protein and digest protein. So you actually have to expend energy to break these foods down. It's called the thermic effect of food. Protein tends to have a very high thermic effect, and fiber tends to have very high thermic effect as well, whereas the other foods, in particular the carbohydrates, tend to have a lower thermic effect, those with lower fiber content.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, many people think that meat causes colon cancer. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, a lot of that comes from, the preconceived notion that they've got that meat rots in the large intestine and so forth. The reality of the situation is meat is broken down in the small intestine by a mechanism called proteolysis. So we use enzymes as humans to break down protein, and we absorb it very quickly in the small intestine, okay? So very little of the stuff actually makes it into the hindgut or into the colon. So it's ironic that people think protein causes cancer when very little of it actually makes it into the hindgut or colon. Now, the misconception comes from data that was pushed out by the IRAC, or the World Health Organization, sometime in 2006, where they sat down and had a look at about 800 epidemiological studies, which looked at the link between processed meat and cancer. Of these 18 of these studies potentially showed a link. The other, 780 didn't. They chose to ignore the 780 studies and focus on the 18 studies that did. And of that, they concluded that processed meat might raise the risk of colorectal cancer by 18%, which in the fields of nutrition is based on food frequency questionnaires is a very, very poor metric or a poor value. Generally, for it to be clinically significant, the relative risk needs to be close to 200% increase. 18% increase is 1.18, which immediately deems it clinically insignificant. But they still chose to go with that, and somehow using the link between processed meat and cancer, they also lumped in red meat as a potential carcinogen. Very, very problematic recommendations that were controversial at the time, and they still remain controversial to this day. So I've got a very big problem with that recommendation. I don't think red meat causes cancer. I think excess calories and metabolic syndrome is the primary driver behind why we've got a cancer epidemic.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, why animals in the wild are not obese?
Yeah, that's a great question, Srinivas. Wild animals, that are not domesticated, obviously, they simply eat to a protein target. And this applies back to the protein leverage hypothesis that we as a species, or every single member of the species, is hardwired to seek out a protein target. Once that protein target is met, your brain will activate the satiety centers to say, this is fine. So whether you're a carnivorous animal consuming other animals to meet the protein target, or if you're a grazing animal, this is very different. So it just shows you the power of carnivorous type eating versus herbivores, because herbivores need to graze for long periods of time. They need to spend the vast majority of their day eating to achieve that protein target, because what they're consuming is fundamentally a nutrient poor diet, right? But then they concentrate these nutrients in their tissue. A carnivore comes along, and a carnivore might only eat once every week or once every few days. It just shows you, when you're eating nutrient dense foods, the requirement to eat constantly is diminished. And so we have to remember that we are neither carnivores or herbivores. However, we are very flexible and adaptable. And in the last 2 million years of our evolution, certainly we have lent more towards a carnivorous type of eating to allow for maximal satiety, to allow for maximal delivery of nutrients to our bodies.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, now we have questions from subscribers.
Of course.
Yeah. First question is, can we reverse fatty liver disease through food?
Absolutely, you can. Absolutely, you can. So you need to fall into a calorie deficit. Okay, that's number one. I'm not a big fan of saying, calories cause disease. However, I do understand that calories do matter. But what matters more than calories is satiety. Okay, so we need to fall into a calorie deficit, which you can do through eating salads, but you will never feel satisfied, which you can try and do through eating fruits, but you will never feel satisfied. So there's always a tendency to overeat and go above your calorie target. Whereas this is why it's powerful to be able to consume a lot of meat, fish, and eggs, because you will generally get satiety and not eat constantly. Therefore, you can fall into a deficit very easily, much easier. And also, as we discussed, that there is a thermic effect of food where your body then has to expend energy. Often 25% of the energy that's been eaten in terms of protein will have to go towards breaking down that protein and assimilating it into your body. So calories and satiety matter. Satiety matters far more than calories.
Thank you, Pran. Second question is how to deal with acidity.
You can't deal with acidity because we are acidic by nature. But the problem is, I mean, when you say acidity, a lot of people tend to get these symptoms called dyspepsia, which is a pain. Often that is a motility thing. So the stomach's simply not moving very well. And often that happens if you're fermenting a lot, liberating a lot of methane and hydrogen in your gut. If there's a lot of gut-based gas, the motility is compromised. So it just doesn't move very well. The same thing can be applied to regurgitation and reflux. It's not an acidity problem. It's simply that your stomach's unable to hold on to the acidic contents that it has. We, as I discussed, we will always have acid and will always continue to have acid, and we're meant to. It's just we can't contain it anymore. And that often comes down to poor diaphragmatic strength, poor motility. In addition, we are constantly relaxing the lower esophageal sphincter, which is a valve that controls all of this. And that comes about when we're excessively fermenting downstream. Goes to show that we're not really built for fermentation. We're not optimized for it.
Thank you, Pran. My next question is, what's the best way to deal with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which you are expert?
Eat a diet that we as humans were built to eat. You know, and this is why I believe maximizing protein, where it's making up 50 to 60% of your diet, will generally sort that issue out. In addition, the carbohydrates that you consume, try and go for carbohydrates that are less likely to ferment. So things like a sweet potato or a pumpkin or even a potato is less likely to ferment in the gut, right? These are starches. They're absorbed by the small bowel, and we're built to eat that stuff. Not if you're metabolically unhealthy. You're better off sticking to a high protein diet. But if you're a well person who's metabolically healthy and you do want to introduce some carbohydrates to your diet, don't eat the non-absorbable carbohydrates. Like a lot of people tend to eat a lot of garlic and onion and foods like this, which are simply not essential for human life. They carry with them very little in the way of nutrient value, but they tend to ferment a lot, right? And the fermentation is a problem. So IBS is often tied in with that. And this is why diets such as a low FODMAP diet, which is basically a low carbohydrate diet, tends to be very successful. But I prefer a high protein, low carbohydrate diet because you're essentially minimizing the amount of fermentable carbs in your diet.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, next question is, what foods should we eat to tackle gastric problems and bloating?
Yeah, same sort of answer to before. Essentially, irritable bowel syndrome is made out to be a disease, right? Abdominal bloating is made out to be a disease. These are not. These are simply a human consuming a diet that they are no longer built to eat. You know what I mean? We've got to make sure that we're consuming foods that is easy for our digestive tract. If we're consuming foods that are chemically and genetically modified with high levels of fermentable components in them, the gut will struggle with that. And we've got to take into consideration that modern day farming is very difficult, a different situation to farming 50 to 60 years ago. They are much richer in carbohydrates, these fruits and vegetables, with a diminished nutrient value. So excessive carbohydrates have to end up in the colon, where our gut bacteria then deals with it, but there's sequelae to all of that follows. So, you know, there's quotes in the American Journal of Gastroenterology that say irritable bowel is 99% of it is made up by diet. There are other factors that contribute, things like visceral hypersensitivity, where some people are just a bit more connected to their gut. There are a lot of people that will get bloating, but they don't necessarily interpret that as a problem. Whereas there are other people where they're a bit more in tune with their gut. They can get even a little bit of bloating and interpret that as a problem. With the fundamental solution has to be eat in a way where you're not bloating or you're not generating the gas. Eat in a way that humans were supposed to eat.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, can we do low carb diets if gallbladder is removed?
Yeah, absolutely, you can. I mean, a lot of gallbladder loss is secondary to gallstones or sick gallbladders, which is a condition called acalculous cholecystitis. Now, we know that metabolic syndrome, diabetes, being overweight, fatty liver, all of this is linked with sick gallbladders and gallstones. The mechanism behind that is relatively simple. So people often lose gallbladders because of a poor dietary strategy anyway, or metabolic syndrome and evolution. Now, Once the gallbladder is lost, you're less able to regulate the amount of bile that enters your gut in response to dietary fat. But generally, after a few months, people will adjust to that. So some people, when they lose their gallbladder in response to fat, they can have diarrhea. But generally, the body will readjust itself very well. Very few people struggle with long-term diarrhea in response to fat following gallbladder surgery. You can introduce a bile salt binder to help those people, but yeah, absolutely, you can do a low carbohydrate diet following gallbladder removal.
Thank you, Pran. Pran, next question is how to treat piles or hemorrhoids?
Look, I mean, you can have them surgically dealt with or ligated, which is, where we place rubber bands around them. But again, we need to go back to the fundamental problem. I think piles are basically varicose veins of the rectum and the anal canal. I think, a lot of people tend to strain a lot. They sit on the toilet, they push hard, they read their phone for hours on the toilet seat. I think we've got to try and minimize all those behaviors. I think we should develop toileting hygiene where someone is on the toilet, has an easy bowel motion, gets up and moves on. By putting less pressure on that region, you generally will alleviate the requirement for any type of surgery or banding. Those things tend to be short-lived, in particular banding, and these things generally tend to recur unless the fundamental problem is dealt with.
Thank you so much, Pran. Pran,
No
how to instantly deal with heart-burning sensation that comes with gas?
Yeah. Look, as I said to you before, heartburn is the inability to contain stomach contents within the stomach itself. So this spills out into the esophageal tissue, which is not designed to deal with that level of acidity. So that then elicits some form of pain response or symptom in a patient who then responds to that with an anti-acid drug, generally in the modern world. But the whole trick has to be to contain that stomach acid within the stomach. And how do you do that? As I said, reduction of those transient esophageal contractions, which are stimulated by fermentation downstream. So that is really quite important that we deal with fermentation and control how much fermentation we're doing within our gut. This is why the abdominal bloating and reflux will coexist. Generally, they will go hand in hand.
Thank you so much, Pran. Pran, last question. Would you like to issue a 7-day challenge to our subscribers?
Yeah, look, I think a good challenge would be to say, look, try and maximize protein, emphasize protein with every meal. I mean, most people eat 2 or 3 times a day. I think try and get away from the snacking habit. That's a terrible habit for the gut. You have to rest your gut at some point. 3 meals a day or 2 meals a day where you're emphasizing animal-based protein, which is meat, fish, and eggs, and trying to get at least 30 to 40 grams minimum with those meals. Depending on your requirement, you might need more if you're a athlete or a weightlifter or elderly. But most people that are elderly need more. But I would say emphasize protein, make it 50 to 60%. Let 60% of your macronutrients come from animal-based foods, and to really try and maximize protein to achieve satiety. Once you've done that, generally everything falls into place with regards to appetite regulation and the weight loss. So I think people say, well, lentils are protein or chickpeas are protein, but it's important to remember these are inferior proteins that come with a lot of baggage. And yes, you can survive on these things and extract protein, but it's not ideal to maintain lean muscle mass. And in addition, to get the same level of nutrients or protein from these sort of foods, you have to eat far more in terms of calories. Then you end up with the non-absorbable carbohydrates that will come along with beans and lentils and legumes, which then you ferment downstream, and it sets up a vicious cycle. This is why I always push the idea, and I would encourage your viewers to maximize the amount of quality protein in their diet and make it 50 to 60% of their intake. It doesn't even need to be that high. Anything over 30% probably will achieve good levels of satiety.
Thank you so much, Pran. So thank you so much for coming to the show and helping us to become more healthy.
Thank you, Srinivas. Thank you for having me on, and I appreciate all the wonderful questions you've asked me today as well.
Thank you.
I hope everyone subscribes to BNS Goku Great. He has a fantastic channel.